So in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, we have this period known as détente. Détente basically means an easing of the Cold War tensions. And we kind of have more cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And one of the best examples of this was the SALT talks. And under these SALT talks, they finally agreed to put limits on the stockpiling of all these weapons. And it kind of froze the proliferation of all these weapons over about a 5-year period or so. We're also going to see two major setbacks for each of these superpowers. The United States, their big setback was Vietnam. So Vietnam, after World War II, it had been originally under the control of France going into World War II. During World War II, Japan sweeps through and takes it over. Well, then after World War II, France wanted it back. And so in the first Indochina War, France was trying to gain back control of Vietnam. Meanwhile, Vietnam wanted their independence. And led by Ho Chi Minh, they're going to drag this conflict out and use a lot of guerrilla warfare tactics against the French, and even with U.S. support in the form of money and supplies, not troops. France couldn't take back Vietnam. And so ultimately, France withdraws. And under the Geneva Accords, they decide to divide Vietnam, much like Korea and Germany. And so North Vietnam was communist under the control of Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam was propped up by this kind of pro-Western regime that wasn't very popular, but the U.S. continued to support it basically because they were trying to stop the spread of communism. And so gradually, over the next decade or so, the U.S. is going to get pulled into the Vietnam War. And it starts small. They start by just kind of trying to prop up the government in South Vietnam. And then they kind of get pulled in a little deeper when they overthrow the Diem regime and install a new leader in power who wasn't much more popular than the old one. And then they start sending troops. And this especially escalates under LBJ in the late 1960s. And under LBJ, they're going to escalate to where they had over 500,000 troops fighting over in Vietnam, trying to stop the North Vietnamese from taking over the South. Again, the fear of the domino theory played a big role in the U.S. entering the Vietnam conflict. And so this is a war that escalated gradually over time. And ultimately, much like France, the United States struggled in Vietnam. And they were winning the battles, but they couldn't win the war. And the war drug on. The casualties continued to mount. It became a very unpopular war, especially back home where protests began to spread. And finally, the U.S. decides to withdraw their troops. And after withdrawing the U.S. troops, North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh is going to take over the South and unite Vietnam under a communist government. However, that fear of the domino theory never came into play. Ho Chi Minh never had any plans to expand communism beyond Vietnam. He just wanted Vietnamese independence under his regime. And so that fear of the spread of communism never came to fruition in Vietnam. However, the United States, who was supposed to be this great superpower, ultimately couldn't defeat this small Southeast Asian nation. And so it was kind of a hit to U.S. pride and power. Similarly, the Soviet Union is going to suffer a setback in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was another nation who had tried to remain non-aligned, not allied with the U.S. or the Soviet Union. But the Soviets tried to prop up a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan. And meanwhile, groups of rebels continued to fight against this unpopular regime that the Soviet Union was trying to prop up. The United States even supported some of these rebels. And again, the war drags on, the casualties continued to mount, and eventually the Soviets withdraw after almost a decade of fighting in Afghanistan. And ultimately, the conflict is what would allow the Taliban regime to come to power in Afghanistan. And they're going to create a strict Islamic state there starting in 1996.